A note before we begin. Heinrich Buchner and Kazimierz Nowak are composite figures, constructed from the testimony of workers documented in declassified CIOS interrogation records held at the National Archives, Q. Every institutional decision, technical finding, and historical event in this story is drawn from the documented record. The men are representative of what that record describes. Kassel, Germany, January 1944, 3 in the morning. There are no heroics here, no thundering engines, no columns of steel moving through snow. There is only the smell of machine oil and burnt metal, the yellow light of overhead lamps too weak to reach the corners of the building, and the sound of men who have not slept enough doing work that cannot wait. Heinrich Buchner is 44 years old. He is not a soldier. He has never fired a weapon in his life. He is a metallurgical engineer, senior quality control, Henschel unsewn, and he is standing in front of a steel plate that came out of the heat treatment furnace 40 minutes ago and is still warm to the touch. He is holding a piece of paper. The paper contains the results of a spectrographic analysis, a laboratory measurement of the chemical composition of this plate, the steel that will become the frontal armor of a Tiger II tank. The number that matters is the molybdenum content. Molybdenum is what makes armor steel tough rather than merely hard. It is what allows a plate to absorb the energy of an impact and deform, rather than fracture. The design specification calls for a molybdenum content of between 0.40 and 0.50%. The number on the paper is 0.17. Buchner knows exactly what this means. He has known since the third quarter of 1943, when the allocations from the Reich Ministry of Armaments changed and the numbers started coming back wrong. Steel with a molybdenum content this low behaves differently under stress. At room temperature, the difference is not dramatic. But at 0 degrees, at -10, at the temperatures of a Russian winter or an Ardennes December, the crystalline structure of the metal changes. It becomes brittle. It does not deform under repeated impact. It fractures. Along grain boundaries, along weld lines, along the invisible fault planes that no inspector can see from the outside. In September 1943, the Ministry of Armaments under Albert Speer issued a directive. Production targets would be maintained. Alloy content thresholds would be adjusted downward. The directive used the phrase "within acceptable parameters." The ministry defined what was acceptable. The ministry had not consulted the physics. Heinrich Buchner picks up a pen. He signs the inspection certificate. The plate passes. He sets the pen down and does not look at what he has just done. 10 meters away, on the other side of the production floor, a man named Kazimierz Nowak is pushing a cart loaded with steel billets toward the forming press. He is 29 years old. Before the war, he was a second-year engineering student at the University of Warsaw. In November 1942, he was transported to Kassel as forced labor under the Reich's Arbeitseinsatz program. He has been here for 14 months. Kazimierz speaks German well enough to understand everything said around him. He learned very early that it was better if the Germans did not know this. Silence has kept him alive in this building when other things have not kept other men alive. He sees Buchner standing at the inspection table. He sees the way the engineer looks at the paper. Not the quick confirmation of a man approving something routine, but the long, measuring look of a man doing an arithmetic problem he has already solved and does not want the answer to. He sees Buchner sign. He sees him set the pen down. Kazimierz pushes the cart forward and says nothing. He has learned that silence is the only reliable survival strategy in this place, and he applies it with the consistency of a man who understands that there are no other options. The plate will be welded to a tank. The tank will be driven to a front. 3 young men will sit inside it and be told it is the best protection Germany has ever built. None of them will ever see this room. To understand what Buchner signed, you have to understand what it was supposed to become. The Panzer Kampfwagen, the 6 Ausführung B, the Tiger II. In the factories and on the training grounds, it was called the Königstiger, the King Tiger. The design competition between Henschel and Porsche had been settled in Henschel's favor in 1943. The Porsche proposal was set aside, though some of its turret components were used in early production vehicles. What Henschel built was on paper a genuinely formidable machine, 68.5 tons. Frontal armor 150 millimeters thick, angled at 50 degrees. A combination of mass and geometry that meant the effective thickness against a direct hit was something approaching 350 millimeters of equivalent rolled homogeneous steel. The gun was the K-43, an 88-millimeter weapon with a barrel 71 calibers long, longer, and more powerful than anything on the Tiger I, capable of penetrating the frontal armor of any Allied tank in service at ranges the Allied crews could barely see across. On paper, it was invulnerable from the front at any combat range any Allied gun could reach. On paper, it was the decisive weapon that would stabilize a front that had been moving in the wrong direction since Kursk. The paper was not wrong about the geometry. The paper was not wrong about the gun. The paper simply did not know what Buchner knew about the steel. The strategic context behind that steel shortage does not begin in a tank factory. It begins in the summer of 1943, over the ball-bearing plants of Schweinfurt. Operation Point Blank, the Allied strategic bombing campaign, was not designed to destroy German tanks directly. It was designed to destroy the industrial nervous system that built them, the bearings, the precision machine tools, the specialized alloys, the rail lines that moved raw material from mine to furnace to factory floor. The molybdenum that should have been in Buchner's steel plate came primarily from Norwegian mines. The nickel came through import channels that were progressively tightened by Allied naval action and neutral country pressure. By the third quarter of 1943, both were arriving at German steel plants in quantities that could not meet the specifications of the original's armor designs. The bombing campaign had not blown up a single tank. It had done something slower and in some ways more damaging. It had changed what the tanks were made of. This was not sabotage in any dramatic sense. Nobody made a decision to build weak tanks. The decision that was made was to keep building tanks and to adjust the definition of acceptable quality until it matched what the supply chain could actually provide. This is how industrial systems fail under pressure, not with a single catastrophic decision, but with a long series of small adjustments that each seem defensible in isolation, until you step back and see what they add up to. Buchner understood what they added up to. He was a metallurgist. He had studied the physics in graduate school in Göttingen. He knew what the ductile to brittle transition temperature meant for a steel plate, with a molybdenum content of 17%. He signed the papers anyway because the directive came from the ministry, because the production quota was not negotiable, and because he was a man who wanted to survive to the end of whatever this was. That is not a defense, it is a description. The Tiger II entered combat for the first time in July 1944 with Schwere Panzerabteilung 503 on the Normandy front. The initial results were genuinely alarming to Allied tank crews. At close range on terrain that prevented the kind of long-distance gunnery that favored Allied doctrine, the vehicle's armor and gun did what the specifications promised. Allied after-action reports described encounters with a tank that could not be killed from the front by anything standard crews were carrying. The fear was real. The fear was earned. But here is the thing about the fear, and this is the part that the Reich Ministry of Propaganda understood better than anyone. The fear of a weapon is always larger than the weapon itself, and it spreads faster, and it does not require the weapon to actually be present. By late 1944, every Allied tank crew in Western Europe knew the name King Tiger. Most of them had never seen one. Most of them never would. There were not enough Tiger Is in existence to put one on every road they would ever travel. But the name moved ahead of the steel like a shockwave, and a shockwave does not need mass to do damage. The production numbers tell the real story. In the entire war, from the first vehicle completed in late 1943 to the collapse of production in early 1945, Henschel built 489 Tiger IIs. 489, for a front that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Russian interior. For context, the United States built nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks. The Soviet Union built more than 57,000 T-34s. Germany built 489 of its best tank, spread across every front it was simultaneously losing. The propaganda ministry had needed a symbol after Kursk. The summer of 1943 had destroyed the myth of German armored invincibility on the Eastern Front, and something had to replace it. The King Tiger arrived at exactly the right moment. A vehicle with genuinely impressive specifications, genuinely fearsome in the right conditions, genuinely rare enough that most people would never have to discover its limitations in person. The reputation was built before the tank reached the front. The fear was manufactured before the steel was poured. Some of that steel had 17% molybdenum, August 1944. The quota for Tiger II hull productions month is 84 vehicles. The factory will deliver 72. This will be recorded as a production shortfall. There will be a report. The report will note supply chain difficulties. Nobody in the Ministry of Armaments will write down what the supply chain difficulties have done to the steel. On the night of the 22nd and 23rd of October 1943, British bombers killed approximately 10,000 people in Kassel in a single night. The Henschel plant survived because the main facilities were on the outskirts and because some production had already been dispersed into smaller satellite buildings. The city did not survive in the same way. 60% of it was destroyed. Heinrich Buchner survived because he was working a night shift and the shelter near Building 14 held. He has not received news of his wife and daughter in Hamburg since July. The survivor lists from Operation Gomorrah, the firebombing of Hamburg, are still being compiled. He has stopped asking at the administrative office because the answer is always the same. We do not have complete information yet. He continues to come to work. He continues to sign the inspection certificates. In his private diary, a small notebook kept in the inner pocket of his coat, not in his desk where it could be found, he writes 4 words in the entry for August 1944. Wir bauen Zahlen, keine Panzer. We are building numbers, not tanks. He does not explain what he means by this. He does not need to. He is writing it for himself, and he already knows. Elbeuf, Seine-Maritime, northern France, August 1944. The Falaise pocket had just closed. In the last 2 weeks of August, the German Army Group B had been encircled, compressed, and largely forced between Allied forces pressing from the west and south. Somewhere between 50 and 60,000 German soldiers were captured. Another 10,000 were dead in the fields and on the roads. The remnants that escaped did so on foot, without equipment, without cohesion, moving east toward the Seine and whatever waited beyond it. Schwere Panzerabteilung 503 was among the formations trying to reach the river. The heavy tank battalion had fought in Normandy through the summer. It had also suffered the mechanical attrition that followed every Tiger II deployment, like a shadow that would not lift regardless of how well the crews performed. Of the vehicles that had crossed into France, a significant portion had already been lost not to Allied guns, but to their own engines, their own transmissions. The simple, brutal physics of a 68.5-ton machine trying to move faster and farther than it was designed to move, over roads that had not been built for anything like it. Near Elbeuf, on a road toward the Seine crossing, one of them stopped. The Maybach HL 230 P30 engine had been designed for a lighter vehicle. It was not a bad engine in the abstract. In a different tank, in a different war, with different weight requirements and different operational demands, it might have been more than adequate. In a Tiger II, covering the distances that the retreat demanded, it overheated. The temperature climbed past the point of safe operation. The crew had warning. But there was no good option for a crew that stopped in the open on a road while Allied forces were closing from 3 directions at once. And the calculation they made, the one that every human being in an impossible situation makes, was that time mattered more than doctrine. They got out. They ran. They did not blow the demolition charges that every tank crew in the Wehrmacht was trained to use before abandoning a vehicle. The technical intelligence value of an intact enemy tank was understood on both sides of this war. The Germans knew it as well as the British, which was precisely why the destruction protocol existed. But training and 3 weeks of continuous combat under encirclement conditions produced different men than the ones who sat in the classroom and nodded at the instructor. The crew of that Tiger II made their calculation and left. What they left behind was, at that moment, one of the most valuable pieces of military hardware on the Western Front. Not because of what it could do, because of what it could tell. This was among the first Tiger IIs captured essentially intact by Allied forces on the Western Front. The hull was undamaged, The gun was undamaged. The optics were in place. The engine, once it had cooled, turned over. The interior had not been stripped. The documents had not been burned. An Allied tank recovery team found it on the road, read the situation correctly, and immediately began the process of securing it before anyone made the mistake of treating it as a trophy rather than a source. Major William Saunders received his orders 4 days later at Chertsey. Fly to France, conduct a preliminary technical assessment at the recovery site. Arrange transportation back to England. Do not discuss the vehicle's existence with anyone outside the chain of command. He was 38 years old. Before the war, he had spent a decade calculating load tolerances for bridge foundations and drainage structures in the West Riding of Yorkshire, working for an engineering firm that cared about two things: that structures did not fall down, and that you could prove mathematically in advance that they would not fall down. He had brought both habits into the Army with him, and they had made him, over 4 years of war, into the kind of technical intelligence officer who was most valuable precisely because he was not interested in what he expected to find. He was interested in what was actually there. He packed his kit. He packed his camera, a Leica civilian, his own, better than the standard issue equipment. He packed a notebook in which he had written, over several evenings at Chertsey, 47 technical questions organized by system: armor, armament, fire control, propulsion, communications, crew ergonomics. The questions ranged from the straightforward to the granular. Question 12. What is the angle of the glacis plate as built versus the angle as specified in the intelligence drawings? Question 23. What is the condition of the road wheel bearings after operational use? Question 31. What evidence of field modification or crew adaptation is present in the fighting compartment? Question 1. What is the actual composition of the frontal plate? He had been trying to answer that question for 18 months from fragments of captured vehicles that were too damaged to give a clean answer, from intelligence reports that gave the design specification without any way to verify whether the specification matched the production reality. He was about to stop guessing. The vehicle was transported back to England by the same unglamorous machinery that moved everything else across the channel: flatbeds, ferries, tarpaulins, paperwork. It arrived at the Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment at Chertsey, Surrey, in the early autumn of 1944, and was moved into a workshop bay large enough to accommodate it, which was itself something of a logistical achievement, because the Tiger II was larger than almost anything the FVPE had previously worked with. The Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment was not a place that appeared in newspapers. It was a government facility set into the Surrey countryside, a working complex of workshops, test tracks, fuel storage, and laboratory buildings, where men in coveralls applied measurement and methodology to the unglamorous science of understanding what armored vehicles could and could not do. It was the kind of place where the war was actually decided, not in the heroic geography of beaches and hedgerows, but in the patient accumulation of data that answered the questions that determined whether men lived or died. What can our weapons penetrate? What can theirs penetrate? Where do the two answers fail to match? And what do we do about it? Saunders stood in front of the Tiger II for a long time before he touched it. He had seen the reconnaissance photographs. He had read the engagement reports. He had worked through the ballistic calculations from Normandy engagements and attempted, with incomplete data, to reverse engineer the armor's actual performance from the outcomes of specific incidents. None of that was the same as standing in front of the machine itself, reading its surfaces the way a structural engineer reads a bridge. Looking for the places where the design was carrying load, where the geometry was doing work that the specifications alone could not fully describe, where the intent of the designers was visible in the physical decisions they had made. Then he opened the notebook to question 1 and started. The protocol he established for the teardown was absolute, and he enforced it with the quiet inflexibility of a man who had seen what happened to forensic value when people started pulling things apart before they had finished documenting them. Measure and photograph the entire exterior before removing anything. Every dimension verified against the intelligence drawings. Every surface feature, weld lines, armor joints, vision ports, access hatches, antenna mounts, track geometry, road wheel condition, toe points, photographed from multiple angles with scale references in frame. This took 11 days. Some members of his team found it excessive. Saunders did not explain himself at length. He said, "The scene as found tells you things that the scene after you have touched it cannot." Then he went back to measuring. The first samples came from the frontal plate. Core drilling, a technique standard in construction materials, testing for 2 decades, extracted cylinders of steel from specific locations on the armor without destroying the plate's structural integrity or disturbing the surface evidence. The cores went to the metallurgical laboratory. The laboratory ran spectrographic analysis, the same technique that had been used in industrial quality control since before the war, which reads the chemical composition of a metal sample by analyzing the light emitted when the sample is excited by heat or electrical discharge. The results came back across Saunders' desk on a morning in October 1944. He read them, set the paper down, and read them again. Molybdenum, 0, 15 to 0, 18%. The German design specification, recovered through prior technical intelligence and confirmed through multiple sources, called for a molybdenum content of 0, 40 to 0, 50%, nickel, 0.8 to 10%. The specification called for 1.5 to 2, 0%. Both elements, in every core taken from the frontal plate, were running at roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the required level. He understood the implications immediately, because he understood materials at the level of a man who had spent his career asking why structures behaved differently than the calculations predicted. Steel is not a uniform substance. It is a structured material, and its properties at the microscopic scale, the crystalline grain structure, the distribution of alloying elements within and between those grains, the behavior of those grains under stress, determine how the material responds when something tries to destroy it. Molybdenum and nickel in armor steel do specific and measurable things. They suppress the growth of brittle fracture. They maintain the material's ability to absorb energy by deforming, by bending, by plastically flowing, rather than by shattering. The technical term for the property these elements preserve is toughness, which is distinct from hardness, and the distinction matters enormously when the thing striking your armor is a kinetic energy projectile traveling at several hundred meters per second. High-alloy armor steel, with the molybdenum and nickel content the German specification required, deforms when struck. It absorbs the energy of the impact across a volume of material and converts it into plastic deformation, controlled, localized damage that keeps the structure intact and the crew alive. Below a certain temperature, called the ductile to brittle transition temperature, this changes. The crystalline structure of the steel can no longer accommodate the deformation. It fractures instead. The energy that should have been absorbed is released catastrophically, along grain boundaries, along internal fault planes, along the invisible microscopic architecture of the metal. The transition temperature for properly alloyed armor steel of this period was, in most cases, well below any temperature the tank would encounter in service. For steel with the alloy content Saunders had just measured, the transition temperature was significantly elevated. How significant depended on the specific batch and the specific heat treatment it had received. But the direction was not in question. These plates would become more dangerous to their own crews in cold weather, not less. They would be more likely to fracture under repeated impact at 0 degrees Celsius or below, not more likely to hold. He wrote 7 words in his internal report that summarized 2 weeks of laboratory work. The armor is the right shape. It is not the right steel. The radiographic examination came next. Industrial X-ray technology had been applied to construction materials since the 1930s. Saunders had used it himself on a pre-war bridge contract in Wakefield to verify the integrity of welded steel girders before they were buried in concrete and became impossible to inspect. Applied the Tiger II's welded joints, the process was technically straightforward and methodically applied. The X-ray source was positioned on one side of each weld, the photographic film on the other, and the resulting image showed the internal geometry of the joint, the distribution of the weld metal, the fusion line between weld and parent material, and any internal discontinuities that had formed during the welding process. Multiple welds in locations that carried significant structural load, the joints between the glacis plate and the hull sides, the joints between the turret ring armor and the hull roof, showed internal voids. pockets where the metal had not fully fused during welding, microcracks propagating along the heat-affected zone at the edge of the weld. In several cases, porosity, gas bubbles trapped in the solidifying weld metal, indicating that the welding atmosphere had not been properly controlled or that the process had been conducted too rapidly for the outgassing that proper technique required. These were the signatures of welds made under pressure. Too fast, without adequate preheat of the parent metal, without the controlled post-weld cooling that high alloy steel required to avoid hydrogen cracking in the heat-affected zone. In a bridge girder, findings like these would have required remediation before the structure was approved for load. In an armor plate, they represented a different kind of failure, one that would not manifest until the plate encountered the conditions it was built to survive. The armor was not thin. Standing at the front of the vehicle, measuring the actual thickness of the glacis plate with the instruments he had brought, Saunders confirmed that it matched the specification. 150 millimeters, angled at 50 degrees. The geometry was exactly what the design required. What the geometry concealed was a material that would not perform the way the geometry promised, and a set of weld joints that would propagate failure rather than arrest it when the critical moment came. He wrote in his notes that evening, working late in the workshop bay by the light of a portable lamp. There is no instrument in the field that can find this. No Allied crew, sitting in a Sherman or a Cromwell or a Firefly across a winter field, could know whether the Tiger II in front of them was the tank its silhouette claimed to be, or something made of different mathematics. The fear the vehicle generated was based entirely on appearance. The appearance was accurate. The substance behind it was not. This was the first finding, and the first finding was enough to rewrite the threat assessment. In Kassel, the autumn of 1944 was moving toward winter. Kazimierz Nowak had been at Henschel for 24 months. He was not a hero of the resistance in any form that history tends to record. He had no contact with underground organizations. He had no radio. He had no plan. He was a 29-year-old man from Warsaw who had studied engineering for 2 years before the war ended that particular future, and who had learned, in the 14 months between the fall of Warsaw and his arrival at Kassel, that survival was a practice rather than a condition. Something you maintained through the daily application of specific behaviors, not something you possessed. The behaviors were not complicated. Do what you are told. Do not do more than you are told. Move at a pace that cannot be called lazy, but does not call attention to itself. Watch everything. Remember everything. Give no indication that you are watching or remembering. He had been watching the welding crews for 6 months. They worked at night, mostly. The day shift handled hull assembly and fitting. The night shift ran the primary welds on the armor plates and the turret ring. They were a mixture of nationalities that the Reich's labor procurement systems had assembled without regard for anything except availability. Polish workers like Kazimierz, Belgian civilians transported under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, French workers under the same system, Soviet prisoners of war whose legal status in German custody made their conditions worse than anyone else's in the building. They worked under fluorescent lights that provided enough illumination to see the immediate work surface and not much beyond it. They worked to a daily quota of 3 hull assemblies, which the plant management had set based on a calculation of what the machinery could theoretically produce. Not on any assessment of what human beings working 12-hour shifts could maintain over consecutive weeks. The preheat requirement for welding high-alloy armor steel was not a bureaucratic formality. It was a physical necessity. The parent metal had to be brought to a specific temperature range before the weld was struck, so that the heat of the arc would distribute into the surrounding material in a controlled way rather than creating a steep thermal gradient at the fusion line. A gradient that would, as the metal cooled, produce residual stresses capable of initiating cracks in the heat-affected zone. The controlled cooling requirement after welding existed for the same reason. These were not steps that could be accelerated without consequences. The metallurgy was not negotiable. The quota was 3 hulls per shift. The weld inspection protocol required a German supervisor to sign off on each primary joint before the next section of the assembly moved forward. Kazimierz watched the supervisors. He watched them walk the line, looking at welds that had been made under conditions that any trained inspector should have been able to identify as problematic, made too fast, without adequate preheat, by workers who were tired and cold, and in several cases operating equipment that had not been properly calibrated since the previous month. He watched them look. He watched them look at the production board, at the count of hulls completed against the daily target. He watched them sign. They were not corrupt men in any simple sense. They were frightened men operating inside a system that had made the production number more real than the physical reality of the work being done to achieve it. The consequences of missing the quota were visible and immediate. The consequences of approving a defective weld joint were invisible and deferred. They would manifest somewhere in Russia or France or Belgium, inside a vehicle that the man signing the clipboard would never see again, affecting crew members whose names he did not know. Human psychology has a reliable response to this structure. It signs the clipboard. Buchner saw it from a different angle. Every morning he walked the line before the day shift began, reading the overnight work the way he read everything, systematically, looking for what was there rather than what was supposed to be there. The overnight welds were not uniformly bad. Some crews, working on sections of the line where the supervisor was more conscientious or where the pace had for some reason been more manageable, produced joints that were close to specification. But the pattern across the building, morning after morning, was of a process that was not under control. The variation was too large. The sources of the variation were not being addressed. The reports that should have triggered corrective action were being written and filed and not acted upon because acting upon them would have required stopping the line. And stopping the line would have required answering questions that nobody at any level of the organization wanted to answer. There was a morning in October, the light still gray at 7 o'clock, when Buchner looked up from the weld he had been examining on a completed hull section and found Kazimierz looking back at him from the other side of the moving line. A Polish forced laborer and a German metallurgical engineer. Between them, a production line building tanks for a war that both of them, from their entirely different positions inside it, could see was going to end the same way regardless of what either of them did. The look lasted longer than it should have. Neither man changed expression. Then the line moved, and the angle between them closed, and Kazimierz pushed his cart forward. They never spoke to each other. There was no version of events in which that conversation could have occurred without risk to both of them, and they both understood this without discussion. What they shared was not communication. It was recognition, the specific and wordless understanding that passes between people who have each, from different directions, arrived at the same conclusion about what is happening around them, and who have each, for different reasons, no power to change it. The system did not require villains. It required people to come to work. Back at Chertsey, Saunders turned his attention to the turret, moving an 11-ton object safely, without destroying the forensic value of what was inside it, was a structural engineering problem before it was an intelligence problem. He spent 2 full days on the rigging, calculating the lift points, verifying the capacity of the crane, planning the sequence of operations so that the turret came off the ring cleanly without binding or twisting in a way that might damage the race or the internal components. The team found it excessive. He told them that the last time he had been impatient with a lift, on a bridge rehabilitation project in 1936, the consequence had been a girder that had to be refabricated at significant cost. He would prefer, he said, to do it correctly. It took the 2 days. The turret came off cleanly. What it revealed, when the team had access to the full fighting compartment, was the third finding, the oldest of the 3, and in some respects the most significant. Because unlike the alloy content and the weld quality, it was not a consequence of wartime production pressure. It was a decision, a deliberate architectural choice made when the Tiger I was designed and carried forward into the Tiger II because the alternative was incompatible with everything else the vehicle was trying to be. Tiger II carried 84 rounds of 88mm ammunition, no autoloader, a human loader, the 4th crew member, whose entire combat function was to manhandle shells from storage racks to the breach, under conditions of noise and movement and fear and whatever was happening outside the vehicle. The rounds were stored in bins and racks within the fighting compartment, positioned for the loader's access. There was no armored bulkhead between the ammunition storage and the crew stations. There was no blowout panel in the roof, the kind of engineered weak point that post-war tank designers would eventually adopt, a concept that did not yet exist in any production vehicle of this war on either side, intended to channel the energy of an ammunition fire upward and away from the crew before compartment pressure reached lethal levels. In the Tiger II, the crew and the ammunition shared the same protected space, separated by the distance between the racks and the seats, and nothing else. A penetrating hit that reached the stored rounds did not damage the tank, it ended the tank. Instantly, catastrophically, with the kind of energy release that threw turrets weighing tons through the air and left nothing inside the hull that could be identified. Saunders documented this with the same methodical precision he had applied to everything else. He wrote the comparative analysis that his protocol required, the standard practice of measuring enemy findings against the equivalent systems in British service. The comparison involved the Churchill infantry tank, then operational with British armored formations. The specifics of what that comparison found have not been fully released. The section of the report covering it remained restricted under the Official Secrets Act until the early 1990s, nearly 5 decades after the work was done. The pattern of the declassification is itself data. The findings about German armor were released. The comparative analysis about British armor was not. The teardown of a German tank had become a mirror. Not everyone was comfortable looking into it. December 1944, Belgium, the Ardennes. Tiger IIs from Schwere Panzer Abteilung 501 and 506 moved through frozen forest roads and morning fog as the last major German offensive in the west tried to reach Antwerp and split the Allied line. The conditions favored them. Limited visibility, compressed terrain, an Allied defense that had been caught unprepared along a front considered too difficult for a serious attack. In the right engagements, against the right opponents, in the first days of the offensive, the vehicles performed as advertised. They were frightening. They were lethal. They achieved things that the Allied tactical manuals said should not have been achievable. And in some engagements, they were killed by Sherman tanks armed with the 76mm gun. Not consistently, not reliably enough to change the arithmetic of the battle in any single day, but in numbers that appeared in after-action reports with a regularity that intelligence officers at multiple levels noticed and could not immediately explain. The 76mm gun was not supposed to be able to penetrate Tiger II frontal armor at normal combat ranges. The ballistic tables said so. The armor specifications, the design specifications, the ones that called for 0.40 to 50% molybdenum, said so. Under those specifications, the calculation was correct. German tank crew accounts from the Ardennes, collected in post-war interrogations and veterans' testimonies, described what it looked like from inside. Not penetration, in most of the cases they described. Something else, plates that cracked across their surface rather than absorb the impact. Welds that failed at the joint rather than holding the structure together. The language was the language of fracture, not of the expected behavior of armor that was doing its job. These were not men trained in metallurgy. They were describing what they experienced. What they described was consistent with armor that was not behaving the way its designers had intended. The specifications they had been issued were for a different vehicle than the one they were sitting in. The specifications were for different steel. Not every vehicle in the Ardennes had the same alloy content. The production batches had been inconsistent. Some hulls, built different points in the production schedule from different raw material allocations, were closer to specification than others. Some vehicles survived hits that should have been survivable. Some did not survive hits that, on paper, they should have absorbed without crew casualties. The outcomes were not random. They followed a logic, but it was not the logic printed in the manuals. The crews had no way to know which logic applied to the vehicle they were in. The exterior looked the same. The briefings used the same words. The documents described the same vehicle. 3 young men would climb in through the hatch and settle into their positions, commander, gunner, loader. And they would be told and they would believe, because there was no information available to them that suggested otherwise, that they were inside the most heavily protected tank Germany had ever built. Some of them were. Some of them were inside something built of different mathematics, assembled by exhausted men under impossible quotas, inspected by supervisors who had stopped asking questions they knew would not be answered, signed off by an engineer in Kassel who recorded the truth in a private notebook and nowhere else. In January 1945, Heinrich Büchner received the production quota for the new month, 90 hull assemblies. The previous month, 61 completed. The month before that, 72. The line had been moving in one direction for 6 months. The quota had been moving in the other. He did not ask how 90 was achievable. The question had become unaskable sometime in the middle of 1944, replaced by the ritual of receiving numbers and acknowledging them and returning to the floor to extract from the machinery and the people and the depleted supply chain whatever could be extracted on a given day. He opened his notebook. He wrote the number in the margin next to the date. He did not write anything beside it. There was nothing to write that the number did not already say. Kassel, Germany, April 4, 1945. The Americans came in the morning, not with the thunder that the propaganda had always promised for the final battle, not with the last stand and the defiant resistance that the radio had been describing for months in language that no longer matched anything visible from a window. They came the way an ending comes when it has been obvious for a long time to everyone, except the people responsible for preventing it. Steadily, from the west, with the mechanical certainty of an army that had solved the logistical problems and was now simply executing the solution. Kazimierz Nowak was 30 years old. He had been at Henschel for 29 months. He was 17 kilograms lighter than the man who had arrived at the factory gate in November 1942, and the weight was not the only thing that was different. The man who had arrived was a student, someone for whom the future had been a particular shape, a degree, a profession, a city, a life constructed around the assumption that institutions would continue to function and that the skills he was acquiring would have somewhere to go. The man who walked out of the building on April 4, 1945, when the German supervisors left and the locks came off and the guards simply were not there anymore, had been trained by 29 months of specific experience into something more durable and less hopeful than a student. He walked out into the morning and sat on a concrete barrier near the loading dock and waited for whatever came next. What came next was a jeep and 2 uncertain soldiers, and eventually an officer from the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, the CIOS, the Joint American-British organization that had been moving through liberated and captured German industrial facilities since mid-1944, collecting technical intelligence from the source before it was dispersed, destroyed, or buried under the competing claims of the occupation apparatus. They were in Kassel because Henschel was in Kassel, and Henschel had been building the most technically significant armored vehicle the Germans had produced, and the CIOs wanted to know everything about how it had been done. They found Kazimierz because he was sitting outside the building when they arrived, and because one of the American soldiers spoke enough Polish to establish that he had been working inside, and because the CIO's officer understood immediately, thought a forced laborer, who had spent 29 months observing a production process, was worth more time than the personnel files the plant management had left behind. He told them what he had seen: the welding crews working past the point of safe practice, the supervisors approving joints that should have been rejected, the quota boards and the gap between what the boards required and what the process could reliably produce. The plates that came through with surface indications that a properly calibrated inspector would have documented and rejected, signed off because the stop and the shift could not fail to meet its number. He was precise. He had an engineer's vocabulary for what he had observed, even in a second language, because he had spent 2 years watching a manufacturing process with the eyes of someone who had been trained to understand what manufacturing processes were supposed to look like. The CIO's officer took notes. An interpreter translated. The session lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Kazimierz was given a meal and a place to sleep and told that arrangements would be made for displaced persons from occupied Poland. The report that the CIO's officer filed that evening recorded his testimony under the category of worker observation, production quality, armored vehicle manufacture, Henschel und Sohn, Kassel. His name did not appear in the report. He was described as a Polish worker, former engineering student. That is how the historical record knows him, to the extent that it knows him at all. Heinrich Büchner surrendered to American forces at a checkpoint near Kassel on the 8th of May, 1945, the day Germany formally surrendered, the day that made the checkpoint formality rather than military necessity. He was 45 years old. He was carrying his identity documents, his engineering credentials, and the small notebook with the cloth cover that he had kept in his coat pocket for 3 years. The SIOS interrogation team that received him understood within the first hour of questioning that they had found someone of significant technical value. Büchner did not need to be persuaded to cooperate. He spoke for 3 days, the alloy specifications and what had happened to them, the production directives from the Ministry of Armaments, the gap between the design parameters and the materials that had actually been available, the inspection process, and the precise nature of the pressure applied to the men conducting it, the weld quality data he had documented, and the decisions that had been made about what to do with that documentation. He was, by every account, implicit in the structure of the interrogation record, a man who had been waiting for someone to ask him these questions. He was not prosecuted. The legal analysis was straightforward. The Ministry of Armaments directives constituted lawful orders within the administrative structure he had been operating in, and demonstrating criminal intent beyond compliance with those orders would have required evidence that did not exist. Other men in other industries faced trials at Nuremberg for what they had done with the Reich's industrial apparatus. Büchner went home. Home was 60% rubble. The city of Kassel had been bombed repeatedly from 1943 onward, and what stood was a partial inventory of what had existed. He spent 3 weeks searching the survivor registries and the displaced persons lists for his wife and daughter. He did not find them in the registries. He did not find them in the lists. He stopped looking at some point, not because he had concluded anything definitive, but because as the search had reached the end of the available information, and there was no further information to search. He did not return to the armaments industry. He found work as a quality control engineer at a small ceramics manufacturer in a town outside Kassel, a firm that produced electrical insulators and industrial tile that needed someone who understood materials, science, and process control, and that did not ask questions about what he had been doing during the war. The work was technically undemanding compared to what he had done at Henschel. The specifications were stable. The materials arrived as described. When a batch failed the inspection criteria, the batch was rejected, and the failure was documented, and the cause was investigated. He found this, apparently, a significant relief. Major William Saunders completed the final version of his report in June 1945. It ran to 293 pages. The classification was top secret. He signed the cover sheet, handed it to the administrative officer at Chertsey, and returned to Yorkshire. He went back to bridge engineering. He worked for the same West Riding firm he had left in 1939, and he brought to it, by all subsequent evidence, the same systematic precision he had brought to the teardown at Chertsey. He designed structures that did not fall down. He retired in 1971. He never published anything about his work at the Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment. The Official Secrets Act applied, and he appears to have been a man who took seriously the things he agreed to take seriously. The report he filed in June 1945 began to be declassified in portions from the 1970s onward. The sections covering the metallurgical analysis of German armor plate were among the first released, technically historical by that point, of interest primarily to researchers. The section containing the comparative analysis of British and German ammunition handling systems remained restricted. It was not released in full until 1993, 48 years after the work was done. In the decades between Saunders filing his report and that report being read by anyone outside the classification system, the Tiger II accumulated a mythology. The war ended and the histories were written, and the Tiger II appeared in them the way it had appeared in the fear of the men who faced it. As the ultimate expression of German engineering, the apex of armored development, the vehicle that would have been decisive if only there had been more of them and the logistics had worked. The tank that the Allies could not kill from the front. The tank that made experienced crews feel helpless at distances where their own weapons were useless. The tank that defined what a main battle tank was supposed to be for the generation of military planners who came after. Some of that was accurate. Some of it was the natural tendency of histories written by the victors to prefer a formidable enemy to a flawed one, because a formidable enemy makes the victory more meaningful. And some of it was sustained, without anyone making a conscious decision to sustain it, by the silence of the men who knew the most. Saunders knew what the alloy content was. He could not say so publicly. The report existed. It was not readable. The myth filled the space where the data should have been, and it filled that space for nearly half a century. The technical legacy of the teardown program took a different and longer route to its destination. The Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee and its British counterpart, the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, analyzed more than 1,000 categories of German military and industrial equipment between 1944 and 1946. The program was one of the largest systematic technical intelligence efforts in history, and its findings flowed into the post-war development programs of every major Western military. The questions that the Tiger II teardown had sharpened: what are the limits of monolithic steel armor? What happens to weld integrity under production pressure? How does alloy content interact with temperature in combat conditions? Did not disappear when the war ended. They became the foundation of research programs that would take decades to fully answer. The Centurion tank, which entered British service in 1945 and would serve in armies around the world for 40 years, incorporated lessons from the analysis of German armor in its progressive development. The ammunition handling arrangements that had concerned Saunders in the Tiger II and in the British vehicles he had compared it to were addressed imperfectly and incrementally across successive marks and variants. The improvements were not announced as consequences of the teardown. They did not need to be. They simply appeared in the way that engineering knowledge appears, as better practice, built on the foundation of previous failure. The Burlington Armor Research Program, which began in the early 1960s at the British Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment, was asking questions that the accumulated post-war teardown data had helped make concrete, not as a direct continuation of any single wartime finding, but as part of a growing understanding of what monolithic steel armor could and could not do. If steel, regardless of its alloy content and thickness, has fundamental limits imposed by physics that no manufacturing improvement can overcome, then what replaces it? The program's answer, developed over 15 years of classified research, was the composite armor concept that would eventually be called Chobham, and that would appear on the Challenger and the M1 Abrams. Layered structures, ceramic elements, materials chosen not for their individual properties, but for what they did to a projectile at the interface between layers. The question had roots in a workshop in Surrey in 1944, where an engineer from Yorkshire had looked at a laboratory result and written 7 words in an internal report. The armor is the right shape. It is not the right steel. The journey from that observation to the armor on an Abrams took 40 years and followed a path through dozens of research programs and thousands of individual technical decisions, none of which can be attributed solely to what Saunders found. But the question he was asking, and the clarity with which the Tiger II answered it, was part of what drove the inquiry forward. 489 Tiger IIs were built. 8 survive. The best preserved is at the Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset, hull number 280273, captured in August 1944, among the first taken intact on the Western Front. It sits in the Tank Hall at Bovington in a condition of careful preservation. Properly lit, properly labeled, accessible to anyone who wants to stand in front of it and try to understand what it meant to the men who encountered it in the fields of France and Belgium and Germany. It is approximately 180 kilometers from the fighting vehicle proving establishment at Chertsey, where Saunders worked, measured in straight line across the English countryside. Nobody knows the precise molybdenum content of its frontal plate. The analysis was done on different vehicles at different points in the production run, and the results were classified and the classifications were lifted gradually and incompletely, and the specific data for hull 280273 is not in the public record. It may exist in a file somewhere, it may not. It does not particularly matter anymore. The vehicle is a museum piece. The question it was built to answer has been superseded by 70 years of subsequent answers. The fear it generated is historical. The men who felt it are old or dead. The men who built it are dead. Kassel, West Germany, 1968. A historian at a West German university was conducting an oral history project on the experiences of workers in the German wartime armaments industry. The kind of project that had become possible once enough time had passed that the questions could be asked and enough people remained alive to answer them. The Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg held the institutional records. The oral history project was trying to recover what the institutional records did not contain, what individual people had known and decided and done in the space between the directives and the outcomes. Heinrich Büchner was 68 years old. He agreed to be interviewed. He had been making ceramic insulators for 23 years at that point, in a factory outside Kassel, where the specifications were stable, and the materials arrived as described, and the inspection process produced results that corresponded to reality. He was, by the evidence of the interview transcript, a man who had thought carefully about the years between 1943 and 1945 and had arrived at a precise understanding of his own position in them. Not a comfortable understanding, not a self-exculpatory one, but a precise one. The historian asked him directly, "Did you know that the steel did not meet the design specifications?" Büchner answered without hesitating. He said, "Wir wussten es, wir haben es trotzdem getan." We knew, we did it anyway. It is not a confession in the legal sense. It contains no claim of personal guilt, no identification of individual responsibility beyond the collective. It does not explain the ministry directive, or the production quota, or the career consequences of refusing to sign an inspection certificate in the Reich's armaments industry in 1944. It does not ask for understanding. It does not offer justification. It is the most accurate thing that can be said about how industrial systems fail when the people inside them are frightened enough, and the distance between the decision and its consequences is large enough. The man signing the certificate does not load the tank. The man loading the tank does not know what the certificate said. The system interposes enough steps between cause and effect that each individual inside it can locate himself at a point where his specific action seems either required or insufficient to matter. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men served as crew members in Tiger II tanks during the final 18 months of the war. The exact number is not precisely known because the records were incomplete even before the archives were damaged or destroyed in the final months of the conflict. They were young men, mostly. The Wehrmacht's age profile had been moving downward since Stalingrad. They were trained to operate a vehicle that the system around them had represented as the most capable armor Germany had ever produced. They sat in it, and they drove it, and they fought in it, with the information they had been given. Some of them were in vehicles that were exactly what the specifications described, properly alloyed, properly welded, with reactive behavior under ballistic impact that matched the design intent. Some of them were in vehicles where the frontal plate had a molybdenum content of 0.17%, where the weld joints contained internal voids that the production line had passed without documentation, where the armor that was supposed to protect them would behave differently in cold weather than the men who built it had intended or than the men who commanded them knew. They could not tell the difference from inside. There was no instrument, no indicator, no way of knowing. The vehicle looked the same from the driver's seat, regardless of what the laboratory analysis of its frontal plate would have shown. They had been told they were safe. They had been told like this by people who had, in some cases, been told the same thing by people who knew it was not entirely true, and had decided that the distance between the knowing and the telling was large enough to live with. They closed the hatches. They drove into the last months of a war that was already decided, and some of them found out, in the specific and irreversible way that men in tanks find things out,